In the first part of my lecture, we looked at some of the theoretical background to Moscovici's research. We learned that he was interested in minority influence, and we learned that he was critical of the concept of attitudes. In this session, we're going to look at the development of his theory of social representations. So when Moscovici made his critique of attitudes in the early 1960s, he already had an alternative, as it were, up his sleeve. And his alternative to traditional attitude studies and attitude surveys was his theory of social representations. For his doctoral thesis, Moscovici had worked with Lagache on looking at the place of psychoanalysis in French society. Moscovici was interested in studying psychoanalysis because it was a highly theoretical scientific endeavor, which had started in Vienna, as we know, by Sigmund Freud, and it had taken off across the whole of Europe and across the world. So he was interested, this harks back to minority influence, how one person comes up with an idea and how this idea is spread and transformed throughout society. Transformed and spread so that ordinary people talking about themselves and their friends and partners will start to use psychoanalytic terms. They might talk about an Oedipus complex. They might talk about Freudian slips. How did this very technical vocabulary become common currency in everyday life? In 1961, his thesis was published, La psychanalyse, son image et son public. Unfortunately, it wasn't translated into English and published until 2008. If you're interested, we've got a copy in the library. So what does Moscovici do in his book, Psychoanalysis, its image and its public? Well, he employs different methodologies, including surveys and questionnaires, employing Gutmann scaling. He also conducts interviews and does a kind of content analysis of French newspapers. He looks at the way psychoanalysis is talked about by ordinary people, by practitioners, and by the popular press, in particular newspapers. He's interested in the way in which three different constituencies, represented by different newspapers, think about psychoanalysis. The Communist Party is very strong and established, so he's interested in how the Communist Party think about and understand and discuss psychoanalysis. The Catholic Church, it's probably waning in its popularity, but still important, so he's interested in how the Catholic Church understands psychoanalysis. And finally, he's interested in the kind of secular world. And what he finds is that there are different kinds of communicative relationships depending on the interests of the groups which produce the discourse on psychoanalysis. The popular press, their goal is simply to disseminate psychoanalytic ideas because they think their readers are interested in it. So, more or less a straightforward communication. This is what psychoanalysts say. This is what it means in perhaps a simplified language. The Catholic press have a slightly different attitude. Psychoanalysis is seen as a potential threat to the Catholic Church and Catholic doctrine. And remember, there's this strong emphasis on infantile sexuality and the unconscious. This doesn't sit particularly well with Catholic theology. However, the Catholic Church at that time in France is undergoing something of a crisis. Fewer people are going to church. There's a questioning about the role of the church in the world. One way, perhaps, of maintaining relevance is to increase the kind of pastoral role of the Catholic Church and perhaps to use some of the ideas from psychotherapy and counseling in this kind of practice. So kind of modernize the kind of advice that you might expect from Catholic priests and the Catholic Church. But they don't want to accept all of the Freudian theory, so their relationship is somewhat selective. They get rid of aspects of psychoanalysis they find unacceptable, such as the libido. The Marxist press, on the other hand, are strongly anti-psychoanalysis. Perhaps strangely, the French Marxists see psychoanalysis as being an American rather than Viennese import, and they think it's just another aspect of American capitalism and imperialism. So they want to fight psychoanalysis because they think it's simply American capitalist ideas being transported into France. So how does this affect the way in which they talk and think and write about psychoanalysis? Well, Moscovici identifies three different communicative relationships. First of all, diffusion. So diffusion is the strategy employed, not perhaps consciously, deployed by the major secular newspapers. So they're simply diffusing ideas without an awful lot of comment. The papers from the Catholic Church, he describes their relationship to psychoanalysis as one of propagation. What they try and do is reconcile this new knowledge to their own particular system. And the Marxist press, their mode of communicative relationship is one of propaganda. They simply want to fight the ideas of psychoanalysis and get rid of it. So they are all about conflict and stressing the incompatibility of psychoanalysis with French life and with Marxist thought. In terms of theory, what's Moscovici trying to do, and what's his theoretical perspective? Moscovici could be studying attitudes, he could be studying opinions, he could be studying beliefs. Instead, he chooses as his basic category representation, and in doing so, he situates himself in research tradition stemming from the work of the great French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Durkheim distinguished between collective and individual representations. Collective representations were shared by all members of a society, and in a modern society there were systemized bodies of knowledge, such as a science or a religion. In contrast to collective representations, individual representations were idiosyncratic, belonged just to an individual, and they couldn't really be formalized. Durkheim was interested in the laws of collective representations, but I think it's fair to say that he didn't think that there was a kind of lawful account to be given of individual representations. He distinguished between organic and mechanical solidarity, and this referred to different kinds of the organization of society. Mechanical solidarity, this was the kind of situation you find in ancient or primitive societies, where everybody is closely bound together and all knowledge is shared, and he contrasts this with organic solidarity, in which there's a division of labour and was found in more sophisticated societies. Moscovici takes up some of the ideas of Durkheim and subtly or not so subtly changes them. He's not interested in collective representations that everyone shares, but at the same time he's not interested in individual representations which are idiosyncratic. Remember, he's interested in how new ideas circulate in a society and give rise to change. He's interested in how minorities influence majorities. So what he's interested in is how what originally is a novel or idiosyncratic idea, an individual representation, becomes transformed to become something which is shared widely, but often is contentious and argued about, like psychoanalysis. There's no consensus, there's no shared collective representation of psychoanalysis in France in the 1950s and 60s. Instead, it's something which is argued about, something which is discussed. So he wants to go between the individual representation and a collective representation which is uncontested, and instead try and strike at the middle level, where these representations are being formed from individual representations and they're circulating and being transformed. So the theory of social representations lies somewhere between collective representations and individual representations. Famously, Moscovici's always been wary about giving definitions because he never wanted his theory to be pinned down and not subject to change. He thought it was a work in progress, and to give premature definitions would hold back this progress. Nevertheless, we do need a definition, and this is as good as we will get. So in 1973, he said, social representations are cognitive systems with a logic and language of their own, and a pattern of implication relevant to both values and concepts, and with a characteristic kind of discourse. They do not represent simply opinions about, images of, or attitudes towards, but theories or branches of knowledge in their own right for the discovery and organization of reality. I think key things to take from this is he's mentioning both values and concepts. They're about emotions, values, norms, as well as cognitions, beliefs or opinions. And note there he's very clear. It's not simply opinions about, images of, attitudes towards, but this kind of knowledge is organized. They're theories, branches of knowledge. And I've highlighted for the discovery and organization of reality to stress the kind of dynamic aspect of social representations. We use representations, these social representations, to understand things that's going on around us. So it gives us some kind of principles or theories which can apply in new creative ways. So crucial to the idea of social representation theory is that these representations are dynamic and in some sense they're organized. They're not sets of single beliefs or aggregates of beliefs. There's some kind of organizing principles which we use to make sense of the world. He also mentions, in the same piece, there's no implication of any clear-cut division between the outside world and the inner world of the individual. And this is quite intriguing. What he's saying is that the old difference between individual and society, between mind and the material world, don't really hold. He argues that often what we think of as being inner and private has its roots in the outer, and when we think, we're thinking not just in our head, but we're thinking with other people. So it's a kind of dialogical theory. So at the heart of social representations theory is the idea of communication. So an individual cannot invent a social representation. An individual can have a novel idea, but as soon as it's born, as soon as you start talking about it, it starts to change. How are social representations formed? Well, he points to two basic processes. These are anchoring and objectification. Anchoring, this is when we come across some new event, some new image, something that's novel, and we try and make sense of it by comparing it to things that we already know. So we classify new social stimuli by comparing them to things that we already know about. And he mentions here what he calls determinism in genesis and transformation. So something new comes along and we understand it by comparing it to something old, or something old has been transformed and developed or elaborated. There's a contrasting process which he calls objectifying. So there's something new which we make sense of by comparing to something old, but he says there's a process by which, in a sense, this is a sort of reversed, because what becomes new loses its newness and becomes obvious. It becomes something which is uncontested, unthought about. So it's the process by which new ideas or social objects are formed into our everyday common reality, our common sense. And something which is very abstract and which might be very odd and strange can be objectified and become a kind of a thing. It's reified. So when we walk around London, we see different kinds of buildings, and we might get a sense of awe outside St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, the way in which we understand these buildings becomes sort of automatic, and in a sense they become just natural. Why I say that anchoring is different to objectifying is that when something is objectified, the truth of what's been objectified seems to become independent of determinism, so its history is lost. So why are things like this? Well, it's just natural. So objectifying is a kind of natural, kind of way in which things are made natural. And what was once new, which had to be understood with respect to other categories, now seems just so obvious, it has a kind of prescriptive hold on us. So when we understand the world, our social world, some kind of categories, they impose themselves upon us as if we've got no choice. It has become naturalized. We'll have examples of this in part 3 of my lecture, which will be online shortly. Other theoretical constructs, well, Moscovici distinguishes between the reified and consensual universes. This maps on, in a sense, to Durkheim's idea of mechanical and organic solidarity. But now, according to Moscovici, we're in a society which has collective representations of the state and organized religion, but we also have a more powerful source of representations, which is science. And he argues that these two different ways of organizing reality, they produce different ways of thinking and being. The reified universe maps on to the world of science, and the consensual universe maps on to our world of everyday institutions. Now, he talks about these as two cognitive systems, and he uses this term, an operating system that performs associations, inclusions, and discriminations and deductions, while the other controls, verifies, and selects by means of rules whether these are logical or not. The latter is a sort of meta-system which retreats material produced by the former. What does he mean by this? This is pretty abstract, and this is one of the reasons Moscovici's work has not been incredibly popular in the English-speaking world. What it says, there are two basic principles of organization. There's one which operates by formal rules and has kinds of rules of inference, and it's all about method, about how we come to conclusions. The other is a way of organizing ourselves which is always about consensus, about maintaining social relationships. So the reified universe is like a scientific discourse, the consensual universe is the discourse of social representations and is the discourse about group maintenance and group differentiation. Difference between the consensual and reified universes in terms of knowledge. Well, the consensual universe is the universe of our everyday life. It's the ordinary knowledge that we all have. It's exoteric, as opposed to specialized knowledge, which is called esoteric. It's profane knowledge, as opposed to sacred knowledge. Our consensual universe can cope with lots of logical impossibilities. It doesn't need precise formalization, whereas science and the reified universe is highly formalized. In our everyday talk, getting on with other people, we can use fuzzy definitions. We don't need, as in science, strict definitions. When we're doing science, it doesn't really matter whether it's me or you or someone in Australia. We learn research methods so we can all come up with the same kind of discourse, so our research can be replicated in different places at different times. By doing so, we're making our work independent of the people who produce it. We're trying to write ourselves out of the system. Whereas when we're talking to our friends and relatives and colleagues or our enemies, it all depends on who they are. It's all about identity and group membership. Consensual universe can cope with change. It's not particularly stable, where the findings of the reified universe are highly stable over time. So those are distinctions between the consensual and reified universe. The theory of social representations is looking at how material, say psychoanalysis from the reified universe, how it gets understood, how it gets transformed when it meets the consensual universe. So finally, for this section of my lecture, what does the theory offer? Well, it's really a kind of social psychology of knowledge. So some theories in social psychology, they're looking at attitudes or beliefs. Moscovici is interested in knowledge and the transformation of knowledge. And he's got some key points to make about the nature of knowledge. He's saying it's not the property of individuals. Knowledge is generated and kept alive in groups. Knowledge is not the privileged possession of scientists. This is something we might have to discuss later. There's the sense that the reified universe is the world of science, and it does have a different status to the consensual universe, the world of social representations. But remember, from the first online lecture, Moscovici doesn't think that our everyday language, our everyday conversations, our everyday life is in some way inferior to scientific knowledge. He thinks it's different, but he thinks that we still have knowledge and can produce knowledge without us being scientists. He's arguing that knowledge isn't simply a mirroring of reality, and this is a theme that Carol will take up in later lectures when she talks about discursive and constructionist psychology. Moscovici is always talking about communication, he's talking about talk, he's talking about people sitting in cafes, reading newspapers, arguing, thinking. At the centre of his work he uses, although as we've seen, he uses questionnaires and surveys, but really what his fundamental interest in is language and communication. So social representation theory is a theory which recognizes the importance of language and how we use language. So when we use the term social representations, De Rosa in 1994 said we've got to be careful how we use it, because sometimes we're referring to a phenomena. So there's a social relation of social representation of something. Sometimes referring to our theory and how we've constructed the theory. And sometimes when we talk about social representations, we're using it to compare one theoretical perspective from a very different kind of theory. So social representations theory can be used as an example, which is, for example, anti-positivist, anti-behaviorist. So when we use social representations, are we talking about something which exists out there in the world, which we've got to discover? Is the social representation our kind of theoretical machinery for understanding what's out there? And are we using it in a very general level to talk about a particular approach to psychology? Often you'll find, when you do more reading, people use these three different ways about talking about social representations, perhaps even in the same article. So it's good to be aware there are different ways of thinking about it. Right. In the next part of my lecture, I'll actually give some examples of social representations, and I'll talk about methodology in some more depth.